Good day, Mrs. Galang, and to future educators. I'd like to quickly introduce myself. I am Lucy Ann Joy David, your first presenter for today. On behalf of Group 1, I'd like to welcome you to today's discussion. Now, let's get started. The historical foundation of education. The beliefs and experiences of education today rest on the history of this field of endeavor. By knowing what accomplishments of leaders in the past, today's educators attempt to build on their achievements. The ancient period covers the primitive, Oriental, Sumerian, Egyptian, and Jewish education. Each period contributed to education we have today. Let us first discuss the primitive education and its aims and outstanding contributions. The primitive education. Life among primitive or tribal people was very simple compared to the complex life that people have now today. Hunting and gathering wild fruits and vegetables are their means of livelihood. There was no reading and writing. Information was transmitted through word of mouth, songs, gestures, ceremonial, rites, and the like. Now, let's have the aims of primitive education. Since they are tribe people, the first aim is the security and survival from dangers that could be inflicted by natural phenomena, such as typhoons and floods, by evil spirits, and hunger because of scarcity of food. Number 2, conformity, which means the interest of one was sacrificed from the interest of the group. Number 3, preservation and transmission of traditions. The ways they were doing things were the best, and they want to preserve it and be transmitted to the incoming generations. Now let's continue with the outstanding contributions of primitive education. The first one is participation of the young in rituals and ceremonies and in the incidental apprenticeship to the activities of the family and the tribe. Number 2, the primitive man started the rudiments of education from which evolved in the modern education systems of today. Next, we have Oriental education, the education for stability. Education aimed to recapitulate the past in order that the individual may not vary from it or advance beyond it. So from China, they want to preserve and perpetuate ancestral traditions. The next one in India, to preserve traditions of the caste system and religious belief. And for Egypt, to preserve religious traditions. And for Persia, to strengthen military traditions. Now let's have the Sumerian education, the education for business development. Sumerians were commercial people. So now let's have the aims of Sumerian education. The first one, training of tribes. Scribes are trained to do ecclesiastical work in temples, mostly writing. Number 2, training of bookkeepers to record their multifarious business transactions. Number 3, training of teachers. And lastly, number 4, training the learners to be good and to do good things, especially to their God and to humanity, called Namdudu. Now let's have their outstanding contribution to education. Through the cuneiform of writing, it conserved the early civilization's origins besides being the medium of instruction and commercial language of the ancient world. Sumerians' outstanding contribution to the education, and especially to civilization, was its cuneiform writing. Now let's have the early Egyptian education, the education for public administration. Let's now have the aims of early Egyptian education. Number 1, the training of scribes. Most students would start their studies at the age of 5, but their formal scribal education would begin when they are around 9 years old. Number 2, religious. They inculcate proper respect for the gods and the pharaoh. Number 3, utilitarian, wherein mother and father wanted to transfer their skills in his occupation and her skills in keeping house. Outstanding contribution to education. Number 1, they created the world's first national government basic forms of arithmetic and a 365-day calendar. Number 2, developed the geometrical measurement and surveying. Number 3, hieroglyphics. Number 4, invented papyrus, a paper-like writing materials made from the stems of papyrus plant. Number 5, developed the first religions to emphasize life after death. Number 6, build great cities in which many skilled architects, doctors, engineers, painters, and sculptors worked. Number 7, build pyramid as tombs for their rulers. Let's now have Jewish education, the education for discipline. Their aims of education was ethical and religious. Their method of instruction was oral and by practice. Corporal punishment was regarded as an essential element in training. Now that we're done with the ancient period, let's now move on to the Middle Ages. The ancient Chinese education. Confucianism probably is the biggest influence in education of China throughout the entire Chinese history. Later in Han Dynasty, a form of public education system was established. During that time, it was not only elites from upper-class families can study in school. The basic philosophy of early Chinese education was based on the writing of Confucius and other Chinese philosophers. The writings of Confucius dealt with the accumulated wisdom of many hundred years. The aims of education. Number 1, ideological and ethical or moral learning, which gave stress to the teachings of Confucius concerning relationships, order, duty, and morality. Number 2, cultural development, to maintain their cultural patterns and usage. Number 3, civil service, to prepare the students to take state examinations to qualify for higher status in life and for positions in the government. And number 4, to maintain their cultural pattern and usage. Now let's have their outstanding contribution. Number 1, the Confucianism. And number 2, the civil service examination. Now we have the early Hebrew education. The aims of education of early Hebrew. Number 1, develop ideas and moral and concept. Number 2, religious, to develop faithful and obedient servants to God to assure harmony and glorious future for God's chosen people. Now let's have the outstanding contribution. Number 1, monotheism, the concept of one and only God. Number 2, the Ten Commandments, the general guide to ethical conduct. And number 3, the Bible. Now let's move on to Spartan education. The primary purpose of Spartan education and the whole Spartan society is to create good soldiers that could defend their homeland, to make every citizen invincible in war, possessing physical perfection and complete obedience to the state. Now let's have the aims of education for women. Female Spartan children were trained in their sisterhood and were taught physical education. They also started schooling at the age of 6 or 7, and at the age of 18, they have to pass a fitness test. If she passed, a husband was assigned to her and she was allowed to go home. However, if she failed, she will become one of the priority. Unlike other city-states, Spartan women are independent and free-willed, as well as good fighters. Now let's have the contributions of Spartan education. First is a well-established government or polis. Second, discipline is one of the foundations of learning. The third one, both genders are equal and independent and free-willed. Number 4, respect is given to elders and mentors. And number 5, teamwork is highlighted in terms of military education. The most that we can emulate from the Spartan is military education as we now have in our schools, and the development of patriotism and discipline. There you have them, the education during the ancient period and the Middle Ages. To continue the reporting on the education in the Renaissance ages, let us have our other reporters.